What is up? What is up, my AP Govers? Today, our lecture is about the structure and powers of Congress. You will notice that I do not have a video in here today. That's because Delia said that it looked really awkward on video, so I didn't put it in here today. But today's lecture is mainly just review, kind of like a wrap-up lecture of the whole unit, just to kind of review over some of the stuff that we've already learned. Maybe a little bit, just a little bit of it is new, but the majority you guys should already know. So if you feel like you already know all this stuff, don't write it down. You may want to write down a little bit, but some of the stuff you guys are already rock stars on, so you do not have to write it down. All right, so let's do it. So we're talking about the structure of Congress, and as we know, the structure is bicameral. So there's two houses, there's two chambers. Can you guys guess what they are? If you guys do not know these, oh my goodness, I'm going to feel like the worst teacher ever in American history. The first one is the House, and the second one is the Senate. Very good, very good. All right, so many other nations, not the United States, but those nations like Britain, which is England, they also have two House legislators. However, the upper house is usually mainly ceremonial, and there's aspects of our upper house, the Senate, being ceremonial, but overall it is not. They do a very specific job. Now, why would we even have these two houses in the first place? We've learned this before, but it's going to be to protect against an overly powerful legislature. So when there's two, it's more difficult to get things done. When there's two houses of Congress, it's essentially more inefficient. But that's exactly the way they designed it. That's exactly what they wanted. They wanted it to be inefficient, because if it was easy, if things were easy to get passed, if laws and bills were easy to get passed, then perhaps the government could just steamroll ahead, right, and infringe on people's rights. But now that it's more difficult, it's more inefficient to get things passed, then people's rights are kept in check. And this is true today. The House of Representatives was expected to reflect popular will of the average citizen. That's because they are elected every 2 years compared to the Senate, which is they are elected every 6 years. So the House, they're more, I would say, more properly reflected among what our will is as constituents. However, the Senate, remember, they're elected every 6 years. So because they're elected every 6 years, they're going to provide more stability, more continuity, and this is going to also allow them to dig in the details a little bit more than normal, than might they do in the House, to really get in depth with their deliberation and debate. And can you guess it? This was part of the Great Compromise, also known as the Connecticut Compromise, at the Constitutional Convention in the late. Can you get it? Which year? The late 1780s. Very good. All right. So let's move on now to some constitutional powers that are granted to Congress. So these are what you would call your enumerated powers. Guys, this is on the test, absolutely 100%. I think on every single AP test gov I've seen, enumerated powers is mentioned. So when something is enumerated, when Congress has these enumerated powers, these are powers that are actually spelled out in the Constitution. Have we talked about it? Yes, we have. However, I want to talk about it again. So these are specific. As you can see, there's a lot of them. We'll just go through each one. If you want to pause it, that's cool. But these are specific powers that Congress has. Number one, to levy taxes. Now, this is going to be, I would say, and I would argue, the most important power that Congress has. Write that down in your notes. Levying taxes, creating taxes, is the most important part, the most important job of Congress. I've seen that on a past test. What is the most important job or role that Congress has? The answer is to levy taxes, or you can even talk maybe something about spending as well. Taxes and spending, that is their most important job. And just to review, that kind of looks like revenue, but just to review, revenue bills, those must begin in the House. I have also seen that on the test. Revenue bills must originate in the House. Do they always? Not really. However, technically, constitutionally, they are supposed to. So spending money is also another very big important job of Congress. So spend money for common defense, public welfare, borrowing money, from China right now. Number 4, it's bolded. So that means it's important to regulate foreign interstate Indian commerce. This clause has been tested a lot in the courts because it's very broad. Now, what I'm listing here for you, there's a bunch of them. All these jobs or roles or enumerated powers that I'm explaining here are all in the Constitution specifically. My question to you is where? Where are they in the Constitution? Can you guess it? The answer is Article 1, Section 8. In Article 1, Section 8, if you bust out your handy-dandy pocket constitutions, I wish there was a camera because you could see me holding it up. However, if you go to your handy-dandy pocket constitutions, you will see all these listed specifically in Article 1, Section 8. All right, so more with this idea of the Commerce Clause is what it's referred to. This is, like I said, it's tested frequently. So think about some of the court cases we've discussed. Gibbons versus Ogden, for sure. That dealt with commerce specifically. U.S. versus Lopez, that dealt with this Commerce Clause and the use with guns in schools. So this is tested frequently a lot. Number 5, establish naturalization and bankruptcy laws. So naturalization is like citizenship. Bankruptcy, hopefully we don't have to learn what that is. I've never learned. Hopefully none of you will ever have to learn about bankruptcy. Coin money, okay? Establish weights and measures. Our weights and measures are very different compared to the rest of the world. We are not on the metric system. Punish counterfeiters. Please do not counterfeit. It's against the law. Congress will punish you. Establish post offices. Right now, as I'm doing this lecture, it is February of 2015, and if you look at the news recently, the post office is getting a little bit of a facelift. They're getting different trucks, so very interesting. But so it's Congress's job to establish the post offices, grant copyrights and patents, create courts inferior to the Supreme Court. Now we're going to talk about this more specifically in, I think, 2 more units. However, there are obviously courts that are lower than the Supreme Court, district courts, federal courts. So we'll talk about those once we get there. It's Congress's job to create those. Notice that it's not Congress's job to create the Supreme Court. So courts inferior or lower than the Supreme Court. Number 12, define and punishing piracy, piracy, and then also declare war. Guys, this is so important. This is incredibly important. This is so important that I'm going to bold this. Let's bold that. Let's go back here. It is Congress's job to declare war. This is another idea or concept that I've seen, I think, on every single released AP Gov test. They will ask you this: whose job is it to declare war? Congress. It's not the president. He or she will not decide to declare war. Now, they have the war powers, which we talked about in the past, but their job is not to declare war. It's Congress's job to declare war. And then raise and support an Army and Navy. Now, something that's interesting about this one is that, let's say the president is going to war, no declaration of war. Something Congress can do is, if they don't agree with this, they have the power of the purse. So what they can do is they can essentially cut funding to support the military. And if they cut funding, well, guess what? There's no more war. So this is a very interesting power that is enumerated or spelled out specifically in the Constitution for Congress. Now, I know some of you guys are visual learners. So here, there's everything essentially that I just talked about. However, in visualization, in a picture. So if you want to pause this, you can. We have another one here. If you want to pause it, feel free. I love number 6, punish counterfeiters. Do not use monopoly money at McDonald's. Okay, here's another one. These are war powers. These are some of the ones I did not talk about specifically, but that's okay. These were listed as the last one in the notes. I'll kind of all put together. Now, next we're going to talk about what are called implied powers. So these implied powers, are they specifically talked about and expressed in the Constitution? No, they are not. However, they are implied, they are suggested, and they are suggested and implied based on something that we have learned called the elastic clause, or the necessary and proper clause, as is also known in the Constitution. This is also in Article 1, Section 8. It says, to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution execution the foregoing powers and all other powers vested by this Constitution in the government of the United States or in any department or office thereof. So think of like a rubber band. It's elastic. It can be stretched as it needs to be in order for Congress to do something that might not be specifically listed in the Constitution. So these are the necessary and proper clause, and these are also known as the elastic clause, elasticity clause. I think I've heard it as well. So some examples of this are the national bank. We do not currently have a national bank, kind of, not really, but the national bank is an example of this with Alexander Hamilton, who's fighting for the national bank. Conscription, which is the draft. So is the draft specifically listed in the Constitution? No, it is not. However, it is implied that Congress has this power for conscription. Paper money, Air Force. How could they have ever thought of the Air Force in the Constitution? They could not, because it was finalized in 1789 and there were no airplanes. So Air Force, CIA, spies. Something that I really want to go over is that these implied powers are extremely controversial. So these will get debated a lot in the court system, in the Supreme Court. A lot of Supreme Court cases are based on these implied powers, whether or not Congress should have done this or that. And this is due to what's called strict versus loose constructionist approaches. So if you're a strict constructionist, you believe that if it's not listed in the Constitution, then we should not do it. So, for example, the National Bank is not listed in the Constitution. Therefore, if you're a strict constructionist, there should be no national bank. However, if you're a loose constructionist, then you're going to say, well, you know what? Is a national bank listed directly in the Constitution? No, it's not. However, we can probably imply, based on the necessary and proper clause, that that should be Congress's job to create a national bank. So that's the difference between a strict constructionist and a loose constructionist. I have seen this on the test, so I would write that down if I were you, especially if you want to pass a test. Now, next we have inherent powers. Now, technically, inherent powers are different than implied powers. Technically. However, sometimes what we like to do is jumble them up with implied powers, but technically they're not. Inherent powers are powers by the government, the national government, that are basically just powers because the government is a government, because they are a sovereign government. So these powers are they're kind of like no-duh powers, I guess you can say. So they have these simply by virtue of being a sovereign government. So what are some examples of these? Immigration, getting territory, acquiring territory, maybe granting diplomatic recognition. So the question of the day is, what the heck is the difference between inherent powers and implied powers? They kind of seem the same. Inherent powers, like I said, these are powers based on the fact that our government is a sovereign government, but more specifically, inherent powers are not really controversial. Whereas these powers, implied powers, are. So the idea of the draft or the national bank, these can be very controversial topics. On the flip side, like regulating immigration, we know that we have to regulate immigration. So these are not really necessarily controversial. Now, immigration by itself is very controversial in how we should regulate immigration. However, the idea of regulating immigration is really not that controversial. Same thing with acquiring territory. I mean, I can't imagine anybody that would want to make that a controversial topic. I guess they possibly could, but that is going to be the big difference between those powers that are inherent, so those powers that are just in the government because they're the government, that's what inherent means, and then implied. Okay, so make sure you know the differences of those. All right, so here's some institutional powers. So, i.e., that means that is, powers that relate to the system of checks and balances. So our first one is going to be that the Senate can ratify treaties with 2/3 vote. Now this is difficult to get 2/3 vote. You need 67 votes or 2/3. An example of this is think back to your U.S. history classes, whether you took APUSH or non-AP U.S. history. Think back to a treaty that was not ratified with 2/3 vote. The most famous or the most, I guess, well-known example is the Treaty of Versailles, World War I. At the end of World War I, our Senate in America did not ratify the Treaty of Versailles. Remember Wilson's 14 points. His 14th point was a League of Nations. That was his idea. That was his baby. Yet America did not ratify that because they did not get the necessary 2/3 vote. Also, part of these powers is for the Senate to approve presidential appointments with a simple majority vote. So they need over half for presidential appointments, and this deals a little bit with like the nuclear option, but this gets very complex. However, just to say it, I guess briefly, technically you do need a simple majority vote on the test. If they ask you something along the lines of, what does the Senate need in order to approve a presidential appointment? The answer will be like a simple majority vote. However, of course, you know there's a filibuster, which you need 60 votes for cloture. However, if it's a non-Supreme Court appointment, then you can technically just have, or let me rewind. Rewind. If it's a non-president, or if it's a like a non-Supreme Court judge appointment, then the nuclear filibuster option comes in place to where they only need majority. However, if it's a Supreme Court appointment, then you still need to get past cloture for a filibuster. If you have a question about this, I'll answer it in class. I know that's a little bit confusing, but just make sure you have down the bold Senate approves presidential appointments with simple majority vote. I'm just trying to mess with your heads. I'm just trying to confuse you. Do not listen to me. Now the House, they can impeach. We know this already. That's one of the powers that they have. And in order to impeach in the House, you only need a simple majority vote. Now, remember impeachment. Impeachment does not mean removal. Impeachment is just kind of like, we're going to arrest the president, kind of. Now, they don't arrest him, but it's just that formal accusation or that formal charge that's done by the House. And then this kind of gets the trial put in place in the Senate. Now, in the Senate, their role is to try these impeachment cases, and in order to convict, so in order to remove, you need 2/3 vote in the Senate. Now, there's been 2 presidents which have been impeached. That is President Bill Clinton, most recently, and then President Andrew Johnson, the president right after Abraham Lincoln. Both of these presidents were impeached, like I said. However, neither were actually removed. Andrew Johnson got very close to being removed. However, he was not removed, so both were allowed to basically allowed to be president again and not be taken out. Now, this idea, this whole idea of impeachment and it being simple majority needed for the House and 2/3 needed to convict in the Senate, I have seen on the test, so that's bolded. Now, who is actually subject to impeachment? The president, no duh, and the vice president as well. And then all civil officers of the United States. What that exactly means, maybe you can think about bureaucracy, about civil officers of the United States. The House is going to elect the president if no electoral college majority, or if there is no electoral college majority. So if they do not hit that 270 number, remember 270 is needed in order to become president in the electoral college. If they do not hit that number, then it goes to the House. Each state gets one vote, and then whoever wins becomes the president. This has happened. I want to say, let me think back. In the election of, I believe it was the election of 1800. If I'm wrong, please do not be mad at me. But I think that is the correct answer. And then the Senate will elect the vice president. All right, moving on. The proposal of constitutional amendments are needed with 2/3 vote in both houses. We've learned this all the way back in Unit 1. You need 2/3 vote in both houses, and then you need 3/4 vote in state legislatures. And then, believe it or not, if you are in the House and if people don't like you, no, that's not true. But if you do something bad, you can be unseated and punished, and that's called censure. So if you're doing something unethical, you can be punished by your own members of Congress. That's called censure. Now, some of these are directly specific for the Senate, and what we call these is the advice and consent powers. So you don't necessarily maybe need to write every single word on this slide down, but just know that these ideas of this first one, only the Senate has advice and consent powers. Treaties require 2/3 majority. That is advice and consent powers. And I have seen this term, advice and consent powers, in one of the AP tests before, so I would just be aware of what this is. So impeachment requires 2/3 majority. Confirmations of federal judges require simple majority. We talked about that. Same thing with cabinet members. So these are called the advice and consent powers. These are powers specifically that the Senate has. The House does not have these powers. All right, so here's a few powers that Congress does not have. So these are denied powers. And if you bust out your handy-dandy pocket constitution, you will see these in Article 1, Section 9. So Congress cannot pass ex post facto laws. We talked about these, but these are laws that are meant to retroactively punish somebody. So an example of this, let's say Mr. Porchot gets really mad at students using cell phones in his class. So Porchot, he creates a law in his classroom that says anybody that has used cell phones in the past month, I'm going to take them away. Well, that's an ex post facto law. That's technically, you can't do that. Now, if I said, okay, Mr. Porchot is very upset, and from now on, nobody can use their cell phone, then I'll take it away, that's okay. Because I'm not retroactively punishing somebody. But that's a pretty good example of what an ex post facto law is. Nor can Congress pass bills of attainder. We've also talked about bills of attainder. This is punishing a certain group. So for some reason, let's say I want to punish just everybody that's getting C's in my class, right? I can't do that. I'm punishing a particular group of people. I cannot do that. That is against the Constitution. And then lastly, Congress is not allowed to suspend habeas corpus. So that's this idea of holding somebody without a trial. So let's say, I don't know, this is probably a bad example, but somebody's going to murder their husband or something. And for some reason, we don't have a good enough case against this person. So we are going to hold her in trial, or excuse me, we're going to hold her in jail without any trial. We're going to wait until we can gather as much evidence as possible. That you can't do that. That's us suspending this idea of habeas corpus. Now, you can suspend habeas corpus. You can do that in cases of rebellion or invasion. So we do this today. You guys might have heard of Guantanamo Bay. Notice that is not within the territory lines of the United States. So the government claims that we can suspend habeas corpus because they don't have rights. This has also happened during the Civil War with Abraham Lincoln suspending habeas corpus. But all right, guys, so that's it for today. I will talk about this later, not today. But that's it for today. So just make sure you got these notes down. Feel free, text me, email me any questions that you have. Also, you can hold those questions until we get to class. All right, guys. See you later.